She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Crow, Dagaba, donkey, bray, horse, and they even duck a quack. Crow, Dagaba, donkey, bray, horse, and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell people about life in the country.
All right, good evening, and telling the people the story about life in the country. As usual, we welcome you guys to this episode, this new program called AWI. Well, it's no longer new. It's been around for quite some time, some months now, since last year. And with me, no stranger, President David Arthur Granger. Good evening, sir. How are you?
Good evening, Mark. Greetings to you and your audience. We're doing well. We're now in the rainy season in Guyana. So it's May, and as you know, the May-June rains never fail. And we've been having some very heavy weather. It's good. It's broken the drought. So I think the farmers would appreciate the change in the weather.
Absolutely. The farmers appreciate the change. The plants appreciate the change and everything. And let us hope that the drainage and irrigation is working well. Well, I wouldn't keep my fingers crossed on that. For those of you who have shared the link, thank you so much for sharing the link, and welcome to Anansi Web Education. Tonight we are dealing with a very important topic, a hot topic, a topic that will probably have the PPP cringing right now because of what they have done. And this has to do with, as we recall, that the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent, citing the need to strengthen national, regional, and international cooperation in relation to the full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights by people of African descent, and their full and equal participation in all aspects of society, end of quote. And so today we examine the topic, the People's Progressive Party's Civic Administration's war against the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly, that is Guyana. And that is what we will be discussing today, a very important topic. But before we get into my first question, let me take this time to say thank you, President Granger, and congratulations to your administration for ensuring that the people of African descent got the respect that they deserve. Just like all other Guyanese deserve the respect, your administration from 2015 up until 2020 ensure that this has been done with regards to the International Decade for People of African Descent. And I wish to congratulate you again publicly for a job well done. Now, the first question, what factors prompted the United Nations Declaration of International Decade for People of African Descent? President Granger?
That's a strong start to this program, because the process has been going on for a long time, at least 27 years. It is not something sudden. And I believe many people in the Western Hemisphere became more cognizant of the importance of the topic, during the riots and the demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd in the United States. It is well known that people of African descent, in the Western Hemisphere, were brought here as part of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans, and because of the circumstances of their employment, the enslavement, they have suffered, discrimination and, in almost all of the countries to which they were carried, America, Brazil, the Central American countries, the Caribbean. And it was realized at the international level that there needed to be some specific measures in order to relieve the persons of African descent from the burdens, the historical burdens of enslavement and discrimination, because racial discrimination persists. There's no getting away from that fact. The question is how we make people of all ethnicities understand that people are entitled to an equal life. Now, this recognition was, well, many persons of African descent are aware of the discrimination, but the United Nations, starting in 1997, took a decision to examine this problem more deeply, and in 2001, a conference was convened in Durban, South Africa, and that conference issued the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action, the DDPA. And I would say that from that time, they recognized that all the states, not just the states which have a majority African population, but all states in the Western Hemisphere needed to act collectively. And so I would say, to answer your question, that the United Nations Declaration was prompted by the need, which was clear that even in developed countries like United States, and some Central American countries, there was still discrimination, and the murder of George Floyd and several other things that had been happening in the hemisphere were proof that enough had not been done and something else was needed in order to propel this process forward. And I would say that the United Nations started on the right foot, the Durban Declaration in 2001. 10 years after the Durban Declaration in 2011, there was actually United Nations year for people of African descent. And many people in Guyana regard what happened here as just a song and dance show. It wasn't taken seriously. The year was, the year came and the year went, but there was no material change in the attitude of the PPP administration, which was in office in 2011, to the condition of the people of African descent. And the United Nations again decided to have, I don't think it's another go at it, but to make a more serious attempt by declaring a whole decade, not just a year, a whole decade from 2015 to 2024, dedicated to bringing about change at all levels, national, regional, international, to ensure that Africans were able to enjoy fully the economic, social, cultural, civil, political rights to which they were entitled, equal members of society. And so this is what inspired the United Nations Declaration. There is a condition, there is a situation, it is well known, and it will not go away on its own. There needed to be special action. And in Guyana, we were fortunate that in 2015, the first year of the international decade, there was a change in government, and the APNU-AFC coalition, which entered government, was able to pay specific attention in accordance with the obligation that Guyana as a state, what is called a state party, had to fulfill its obligations under this United Nations resolution. And we provided funds, for the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly. And this has been the machine which has been driving the process to achieve the objectives of the United Nations program. So it is not It is not something whimsical. It is not. It is something that is authorized at the highest international level, that is United Nations. And I would say that we were inspired by the action that was taken by the world body, the United Nations, and we were happy to comply with that request. But there are other conventions which we're signatory to. Everybody knows that. And there's no place for racism, there's no place for xenophobia, there's no place for discrimination. And all we are doing is complying with what the government had signed on to for years. And most countries in the international community have signed on to that. And we need to banish the type of xenophobia and racial discrimination, which is still prevalent in Guyana. And in Guyana, particularly, even after the Durban Declaration of 2001, there was a visit by a UN rapporteur called Dudu Dien, and he reported on the intense racism that existed in Guyana. In 2004, 5 years later, another UN rapporteur, Gay McDougall, came to Guyana, and she, not surprisingly, pointed out that almost every aspect of life in Guyana was permeated by racism. Of course, the PPP administration, using its spokesman of the day, who is now no longer with us, rejected the UN reports by Dudu Dien and Gay McDowell. They resented, they just refused to accept what they said. And these were experts who came and studied, who met them, had discussions with them. So the situation in Guyana, I don't want to say justified the line that United Nations took, but certainly it was timely that a lot of Guyanese became aware that we had to pay special attention to the question of racism. Under the PPP administration, it wasn't simply going to go away. There needed to be an engine, and APNU-AFC coalition came into office at the start of that decade and was able to drive that process further along.
All right, thank you so much responding to that first question there. As today we are, if you're now joining us, we are examining the PPPC's administration War Against International Decade for People of African Descent. That's the declaration. They have been anti it. They have been basically, we can just say they declare war against that international decade of people of African descent. The first question was answered by President Granger, and we go to the second question. Why has a controversy erupted between the PPPC administration and the IPADG, that is the International People of African Descent? Explain, please, why has that controversy erupted? Was there really a need for that controversy as created by the PPPC? President Granger?
In short, the controversy erupted because the PPP never admitted that there was a problem of ethnic discrimination. At the Durban conference in 2001, I believe they sent the High Commissioner in London, Mr. Lalishwar Singh, to attend that conference. So, in fact, the African organizations were more or less sidelined, 23 years ago. And although the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action was accepted and promulgated, it was never implemented. A few years later, the UN rapporteur, special rapporteur, came here, and his findings, showed that there was extensive ethnic polarization and discrimination. And the PPP, although they met with Dudu Dien, when the United Nations rapporteur comes, he doesn't, just stay in a corner or just go around cocktail parties. He met with the government of Guyana and other organizations, non-governmental organizations, and they rejected his report. 5 years later, Gay McDougall, another rapporteur, came, And she made the same findings, and there are photographs you can see of, Ms. J. McDowell meeting the president of the day. And again, the head of the presidential secretariat issued a rejection or repudiation. They simply refused to accept that there was ethnic discrimination and I wouldn't call it xenophobia, but certainly there was ethnic discrimination in Guyana. The controversy, therefore, erupted because in 2020, the PPP re-entered office. They did nothing with the Durban Declaration. They did nothing with the International Year in 2011, apart from having a song and dance show. And they resented the fact that state funds were being used to fulfill the United Nations Declaration objectives. And so they went straight for the jugular. They tried to choke the International Decade Assembly by stopping its funds. Unfortunately, I cannot say if this was deliberate, but unfortunately, we started to see government ministers turning up at the launching of so-called African Guyanese non-governmental organizations and pledging support. Now, instead of uniting, they're dividing. Instead of trying to achieve the objectives, they're undermining the organization, which was funded by the government of Guyana to achieve the objectives of the United Nations Declaration. The clock was ticking all along, and we've now come to the end of the decade, 2024, and I do not know whether the PPP can say that they have achieved the objectives of the decade. To start with, they never felt there was a problem. They never felt there was a problem. So that was the origin of the controversy. They resented the reports of Dudu Dien and Gay McDowell. They rejected the findings of the United Nations that there was ethnic polarization in Guyana. And they've been in denial throughout, it's 27 years. It's been a continuous process of denialism, that there's no problem. Why pay funds, why provide state funds for something which doesn't exist? And there was a controversy because, the International Decade Assembly was using funds to promote its work legitimately, above board, accounts were audited, meetings were held, it was done properly. And the PPP administration just could not accept an independent organization examining and solving problems which we all knew existed. So there was a controversy. On the one hand, the PPP controlled the purse strings and didn't accept that money should be spent in this particular way. And the International Decade, which had already got a program going, was just cut off at the heels. And I would say the assembly stumbled because of lack of funding. And it's a stupid war, and the PPP is waging because who suffers? Is it the great victory to prevent the International Decade from succeeding in its mission? Did they win? What have they achieved? And that is where we stand now. There's a controversy. They've set up, you can see ministers showing up at these organizations. Are the organizations accountable for the money that they receive? Do they have registered members? What events do they perform or do they engage in to promote the objectives of the United Nations Declaration? That is what is the United Nations initiated the process, and in government, APNU AFC felt it was obliged to comply with the United Nations objectives. Could the PPP say the same? So there's a controversy. The matter even went to the court, and the court said this is a huge embarrassment for the country, that a non-governmental organization should bring a suit against the government for a human rights issue. And the Chief Justice, I think, was so embarrassed. They said this thing should go to mediation. This is not a matter for adjudication. It should go to mediation. That, you know, a government shouldn't be fighting down its own people in this way. And this is the situation we have in this country. The PPP administration is fighting down a bona fide African Guyanese organization fulfilling the objectives of the United Nations Decade of People of African Descent. It's a great shame. It's a great shame.
Great shame indeed. Why is the PPP fighting down persons of African descent, and particularly a legitimate organization that is there to represent the interest of persons of African descent? There is no evidence that they do that to any other organizations other than African organizations, and try to create their own with individuals who are not leaders, or for the most part, some of whom are not respected within the African Guyanese community. It's a crying shame indeed. The next question, President Granger, which is the final question for tonight, is how has the PPPC's controversy with IPADG hinder the objectives of the United Nations Declaration? Sir?
Well, this is a good place for our discussion to end, because this is the final year of the international decade. And, you know, I presume members of the PPP administration will gloat and say, well, they've been able to bring this process to an end without providing state funds. I would say that from my position, the country is more ethnically divided now than 5 years ago, than even 10 years ago. And the work of succeeding generations will be made much harder, much more difficult by having to recover this last decade. Because very little has been done over the last 40 months, except, you know, war against instead of calling in, you know, the International Decade Assembly and discussing modifications to be made to its program, it's just stop funding. It is similar to the attitude that the PPP administration is taking to the Ghana Public Service Union. It's similar to the attitude that it's taking to the Ghana Teachers Union. And, you know, those persons who observe politics in Ghana would not be surprised at the attitude that is taken to the International Decade Assembly. That in a question which is so important at the international and regional level, that the Minister of Culture, not the Minister of Tourism, the Minister of Culture, should sit down with the representatives of the organization and work out a program that satisfies the objectives of the United Nations. The PPP should say clearly whether it accepts the objectives or not. And it should say clearly what they have in place. If it is not done by the International Decade, we don't want Thursday briefings. This matter cannot be solved by Thursday briefings and Thursday rants. This matter required an organization, it requires funding, it requires personnel, and it requires programs and policies. And I would say that the PPP has done great damage to the objectives, the United Nations objectives in the International Decade, by what it has done over the last 40 months. It's done great damage, and I think succeeding generations will suffer from this loss of momentum to deal with an important aspect of our cultural relations. It is just like wage war on social cohesion. Nothing has taken the place of nothing has been gained by the victory of the PPP, cutting off the funding to the International Decade of People African people, International Decade of People of African Descent Assembly. Nothing has been achieved. In fact, great damage has been done.
Nothing has been achieved, indeed. Absolutely nothing. I agree with you, President Granger, 100% that great damage has been done. And I hope in the next subsequent program, we can talk about how can we repair the damages. We can't expect, or we don't expect the PPP to repair something that they have destroyed, something that they have damaged. But at some point in time, we've got to repair the damages.
Well, in fact, it calls for an awareness on the part of the non-governmental organizations themselves. Now, shortly after emancipation, I think the free African Guyanese were able to set up the first association, a non-governmental association. And there is a long tradition of organization, and perhaps there are too many organizations, but throughout the years, in Berbice you had RAPAC, and in Georgetown you have the ASRI, African Society for Racial Equality, and then you had ASCRIA, you now have ACDA, you had the Pan-African Movement, Guyana branch. But it is time for the principals in these organizations to maybe put aside their differences and their peculiarities. All of them have different interests. Pan-African Movement is not the same as ACDA, and understand that that division is hurting everyone. But the situation that is being caused here is not the result of the division among the African Guyanese. It's the result definitely of the domination by the PPP, which has a mindset. And when you look at what is happening to the Amerindian People Association as well, you'll see that it's not just the PPP mindset. Is not just about controlling African organizations; they also want to control the Amerindian organization. And if it is resisted by the American People Association, the PPP will probably find ways of dealing with other organizations which don't have the support of the APA. And it's just what I would call a Leninist mindset, that they have to control every aspect of society, that there must be no freedom, there must be no NGO, no human rights association, there must be no other voices in society. And it will take a long time to repair the damage to social relations, to rebuild social cohesion. And I want to call the attention of our viewers in this program to the fact that from year one, when the APNU AFC coalition entered government, one of our first priorities, you may criticize this, but it's to build back social cohesion. Yeah, everybody needs roads, but people in this country now realize that the policy that we pursued in bringing Guyanese together, bringing ethnic groups together, giving recognition to all of the religious groups and all of the social groups, was the best platform for creating national unity. And I don't think there's anything that has happened over the last 40 months that could replace the policy of social cohesion, which was initiated by the APNU AFC. Coming back to the topic, this international decade is all about social cohesion, recognizing every other group in society as equal, and recognizing too that people of African descent suffered immensely, as a result of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans. And this is what the George Floyd incident a few years ago showed, that it hasn't gone away. And even that that incident was a spark that was felt around, that lit fires around the world. Colombia, people were pulling down statues of Christopher Columbus. In Belgium, people were desecrating. Well, you can't desecrate the statues of the King Leopold of Benjamin of Belgium. And in Britain, every country in the world recognized that racism and xenophobia were big problems. And it's a pity that at the end of this international decade for people of African descent, that we have a government which is hindering, obstructing, hampering the achievement of United Nations objectives.
So sad, hindering, obstructing, and of course it's a direct attack on the entire African Guyanese community. Shame on the PPP regime. But again, President Granger, thank you for what you guys did under your administration from 2015 to 2020 as it pertains to the recognition and respect for this here, the United Nations Assembly, as they proclaimed 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. Thank you so much again, sir. Appreciate your time. And please give my regards to your other half, former First Lady Sandra Marie Granger. Thank you so much, sir. And I hope keep yourself covered from the rains.
And thank you and good night to you and your viewers.
Thank you, sir. And to all our listeners as well, thank you all so much. See you back again next time, same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM with AWE, which is Anansi Web Education. God bless you all, and God bless our beautiful country. So long.
Good night.
She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Ask